Good afternoon and welcome to the Nebraska History Museum. My name is John Carter, and today we are having one more in our lecture series dealing with civil liberties and civil rights in Nebraska. I would like to start by thanking some of the people that have allowed us to have this multifaceted conversation about civil rights and civil liberties. That include, first and foremost, our friends at the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation, who provide the funding that allow us to put this out on the television airwaves through Lincoln Channel 5, Government Access Channel, Star City Television, and then also allow us to put it on YouTube, which you can find through the Historical Society's website. If you're smarter than I am, you can probably just find the Society's page on YouTube. I'm not that smart, so I always go to nebraskahistory.org. I would also like to thank the funders, the Nebraska Humanities Council, the Woods Charitable Fund, and the Cooper Foundation, who agreed with us that the topics we're dealing with here are really important and that they have a historical depth that resonates in the present. And certainly today, our topic fits that bill. Our speaker is Dr. Thomas Sanchez, who is a sociologist from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And I've enjoyed working with Tom for a very long time because he's been putting an eagle eye on the important new generation that we see in Nebraska, the Hispanics, and the parallels, frankly, that I see between the issues that we're dealing with today in terms of the Hispanic population and the Germans and Swedes and Czechs that came here in the 19-teens and 20s are just breathtaking. We simply relive history. And so I look forward today to introducing Dr. Sanchez and letting him tell you about history in the state of being born. From Bugeaters to the Good Life, 100 years of Nebraska Latinos. Tom Sanchez.
Thank you, John. And I'd also like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society, and John Carter specifically for inviting me to address you here today and speak about Latinos in Nebraska and the Midwest. I'm excited to be here and have this opportunity to address everybody here today. I am Thomas Sanchez, and I was born and raised in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, way out west. I lived in Lincoln for 10 years at two different times. I got all three of my degrees at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, my bachelor's, my master's, and my PhD. I lived in Schuyler, Nebraska for 2 years when I was doing my dissertation research there from 1998 to 2000, and I did research there from 1998 to 2004. And I lived in South Omaha for 9 years and in Omaha for 11 years. So I've seen a lot of the differences and similarities of the many Latino communities across the state of Nebraska. I've done research specifically on some, and I would say I just lived in others, but as a sociologist and as an academic, I'm always doing research in that sense, so I've done research on most of them. I'm here today to talk about the origins of the Latino community, which was really a Mexican community in western Nebraska, in Scottsbluff and the surrounding areas around and shortly after the Mexican Revolution from about 1910 to 1917. And then I'll kind of bookend that with my dissertation research, which is more recent, which I did in Schuyler, Nebraska, on really Latino immigrants, newer residents, and newer members of the Latino community in the state of Nebraska. So I'll begin with stories about Scottsbluff, and most of what I'll try to do today is tell stories. That's really what I do, and I don't know if I do it well, but that's the presentation that I'll give. So So I'll tell stories about Scottsbluff. I'll expand it a bit to the Midwest in order to provide the context of why, at this point, Mexicans were coming into these areas. I'll come back to be more specific about Scottsbluff's largely Mexican-American community, and then proceed to Schuyler's largely Latino immigrant community and Latinos in Nebraska in general today. As I said before, I completed my dissertation research in Schuyler, so I kind of have that taken care of. And I'm embarking on some research in Scottsbluff. I've looked at some old research that's been done and some old interviews, and I want to continue those into some of the more recent arrivals in Scottsbluff. So I'm looking at one of the oldest Latino communities, start out as a Mexican community, and one of the newest Latino communities in Nebraska. Now, apologies to Omaha, because Omaha really has both of these within the city. It has an older established Mexican community and newer residents. But people know a lot about Omaha, so I will address Omaha a bit, but I'll concentrate on Scottsbluff and Schuyler. Obviously, this can't be, in the amount of time I have here, a comprehensive talk, so there will be a lot of things left out, and I'll try to finish a little bit early, and hopefully there will be some questions with the last 5 or 10 minutes that we have here today. Before proceeding, let me give you just a little primer on some of the terminology that I'm using here: Latino, Hispanic, Mexican, Mexican-American, Mexican origin. Latino, Hispanic, you see here, are these umbrella terms that designate those with origins in Latin America, more or less, right? There's always going to be caveats, there's always exceptions. This represents some of the people, cultures, histories, language from around 22 different countries. And the biggest difference between Latino and Hispanic here is personal choice. It's just what choice people that call themselves either Latino or Hispanic, what choice they use. I will use Latino for the most part. You can see it from my title. I use Hispanic when it's relevant. For example, the U.S. Census uses the term Hispanic. So when I'm talking about census numbers, I'll use Hispanic. And I'll kind of use them interchangeably. I'll use the terms Mexican, Mexican-American, and Mexican origin. And you can see here from the slide that Mexican will designate those people born in Mexico. Mexican-American will be used for the second generation into the third, fourth, and fifth generation. And Mexican origin will refer to all those persons, citizens and permanent residents, et cetera, et cetera. Again, these are terms that are more or less. There's always caveats. There's always going to be sometimes larger and sometimes smaller differences. Let me go back a little bit and talk about the title. I noticed on the publicity that there was a picture of an old Nebraska football team. And I just want to be clear that I'm not going to talk about Latinos that played on the Nebraska football team. Okay. So if you came here to hear that's not what I'm going to talk about. The reason I chose these two terms, Bugeaters and the Good Life, is because one of the things that I want to show is that this especially the older Mexican American communities, other than some differences that I'll get to, are much like many other communities in Nebraska. Not a lot of differences. One of the first memories that I have, and it's one of those things that's been talked about so much, I don't even know if I really remember it, if I just have heard so many people talk about it, but it relates to the Bugeaters. I remember the 1971 Nebraska-Oklahoma football game, right, with Johnny Rodgers running for a touchdown. And so this is one of my first memories. And I use that because I think people oftentimes see or hear about or learn about Mexicans or Mexican Americans and have this idea that they're so much different. And in this case, my family and my parents too, still today, are huge Nebraska football fans. They're not even sports people, right, but they love Nebraska football. Another way that this becomes relevant for me is when I'm doing my dissertation research in Schuyler, I'm looking for signs or symbols of assimilation, signs or symbols that differentiate between Latino newcomers and older residents, older white residents that, and I don't mean older age-wise, I mean people that have been there for a longer period of time, people born in Schuyler, more or less. And one of the symbols and signs that I thought I could recognize was that the Anglos had Nebraska paraphernalia, big red ands or flags or what have you in their yards and jackets and this kind of thing. And I say I thought I had that because when I was in Schuyler and I was teaching adult English as a second language, ESL, and one of the students that was there, and he spoke English but not very well. And I remember a few months into teaching him there, he had probably been in the country for a couple of years and in Nebraska most of that time. And he came with his brand new red leather Nebraska jacket. And I don't know how much those things cost, but it must have cost him $300 or so. And he was very proud, and he was very proud to be a Nebraska fan. So in terms of assimilation, I don't know that I was completely correct in thinking that if I saw symbols of Nebraska fans, that would be a white household, and no symbols would be a Latino household. So it really just shows how the football team, for good and for bad, brings people together in the state. The Good Life I chose, I don't think it still is, but it was a kind of a motto of the state. And again, I think that Latino immigrants contribute to, not just Latino immigrants, Mexican Americans and Latino immigrants contribute to and are part of that good life. So I deliberately chose that to put in the title there. Again, even these communities that came in the early part of the 20th century and later part of the 19th century were not that much different from the Czechs, Poles, Russian, Germans, who came about the same time as the early Mexican communities. What is different, and there are differences, what is different is the ongoing immigration from Latin America and from Mexico, and migrations from southern parts of the United States like Texas into Nebraska and into some of these older communities, and as I've said, creating some of the new communities, replenishing, as Thomas Jimenez has referred to in his recent book, Replenished Ethnicity, replenishing that Mexican-American ethnic identity and that Mexican-American ethnicity. Another difference is the ongoing prejudice and discrimination that comes from that association that people have, again, sometimes for good and sometimes for bad, with people like myself who are third-generation Mexican-Americans and people that are new immigrants. And I say associations because I think there's a lot of myths about what immigrants do and do not do and what they contribute and do not contribute to the state. And so some of those myths obviously are incorrect, but they're still associated with Mexican-American people. So in that sense, there's this continuity and this replenishing of the ethnicity in that sense. Let's see. Before I really get into the talk here, I know I have this 10-minute introduction, right? Just want to give you a larger overview of the research picture. I want to thank Ralph Grajeda, specifically a UNL researcher. He was one of a number of people that produced a book in 1976 called Broken Hoops and Plains People, much of which I borrowed from to talk about the early period today. Thanks also to my colleagues at the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies, OYAS, at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, whose publication materials I have used liberally for many of the newer numbers and percentages related to Latinos in Nebraska and the Midwest United States in general. I have the OYAS website here because there's a lot of, hot off the press, sometimes literally hot off the press publications, and you can go to the website to look at a lot of those publications on economics, religion, politics, identity, and other issues affecting Latinos in Omaha, but in Nebraska in general. Okay. I'm going to start here with this flag, and I'll come back to it at the end. This flag I found hanging in the basement of Our Lady of Guadalupe Church in Scottsbluff. You can see there from this picture at the top, you can see the pipes there. So it was just kind of hanging on this wall. There wasn't much to it. I thought, from my point of view, it was particularly interesting. There's no date on it, and I'm still trying to find out the provenance of this flag, right? I've been, in some ways, I wouldn't call it a goose chase, but I've been told, oh, this person will know this person will know about the flag, and this person, and I go to that person, they say, oh, no, go talk to somebody else. And actually, in this case, my parents have done some of the research for me and trying to call people and send me telephone numbers of people that I can call, so I'm eternally grateful for them for that. Some of the evidence of the Mexican presence in Scottsbluff, and I wouldn't say evidence, but there's stories of Mexicans being there as early as 1915 in larger numbers. There was people going to the Midwest and Scottsbluff to Mexico, back in 1850, but in terms of larger numbers, we're really looking at about 1915. And again, this had to do at least somewhat with the push of the violence of the Mexican Revolution. I have a couple stories there. They're, I would say, secondhand. They're probably third-hand by the time they get to me. They're unsubstantiated as of yet. I'm still looking for some of the evidence, meaning that they're in print or they're written down or published. One was a person, Bob Huerta, the late Bob Huerta, that he had an uncle that came to Scottsbluff from the Mexican Revolution, and then in 1915 went back to Mexico from Scottsbluff to fight with Pancho Villa's forces in northern Mexico. Time-wise, that makes sense, because this is when Pancho Villa had control of northern Mexico and would have had a lot of people going there. Again, this is a story. There's no published proof. The second issue has to do with possibly Pancho Villa's sister, again going back to Pancho Villa, living in Homer, Nebraska. It's not in Scottsbluff, in the eastern part of the state. So again, there's these oral histories of these communities starting in about 1915. There's evidence, however, of a community, or what they call a colonia. You can see, right here on the top of this slide, Colonia Mexicana, starting in about the 1920s. Before I get to a little bit of that more evidential history, let me talk just very briefly and tell you about community theory, because when I'm talking about colonias or communities, I want to be very specific. The community theory states that there's no community until there's an outside threat, whether perceived or real. And so in this sense, when I talk about a Latino community in Scottsbluff, or later a Latino community in Nebraska, I'm talking about more or less, again, people with darker skin, sometimes Spanish-speaking, with the newer immigrants, seeing the threat to them in the mainstream English-speaking, lighter-skinned people around them, and vice versa, I'm sure. I'll come back to the flag towards the end of my talk here, but let me move on and talk a little bit about the regional history of Mexican immigration to the Midwest United States. Again, we have this push-pull, the pull being the labor needs in the United States, especially in the relatively new Southwest. Now it seems like the Southwest has been a part of the country forever, but in 1900 it had only been part of the country for about 50 years. So industrialization was starting then. They were starting to expand mines, build dams, build roads, build the railroad, and they needed labor. And for reasons that I'll get to in a minute, some of the other labor sources had dried up. This is a map of Latino settlements in the Midwest, and you can see in Nebraska it follows more or less the railroad which followed the river. Here are these settlements. One of the other things that's significant for me is that Scottsbluff is actually larger than Omaha in terms of numbers of Mexicans at this time. This was about 1930. So again, this history of this settlement that's been there for quite some time. A published study by the University of Chicago Press stated that there were 27 Mexicans in Nebraska in 1900 and 3,611 in 1910. So when I was first thinking about the title and I was thinking 100 years of Latinos in Nebraska, I thought, well, I'm going to have to budget 5 years because I'm kind of starting in 1915. And then I found this piece of information. I said, no, it actually has been 100 years, right? If you count 3,611 Mexicans in Nebraska in 1910. So it raises the question, if the push was the violence of the Mexican Revolution at that time, what was the pull? And the pull was, I'd say obviously, I think fairly obviously, jobs in the Midwest. And there was three main sources of employment where people worked. The first was the railroad. The railroad was used for work, but also transportation. And if we look at a lot of the communities across the state, from Omaha to Lincoln to Scotts Bluff and even Kearney and Grand Island and communities in between, we see that the older Mexican communities are near the railroad. The second pull for the state of Nebraska was meat packing. Right? And we know this is a job that Latino immigrants are still coming to the state to work in today. And then the third one, especially, I shouldn't say especially, only in western Nebraska, was sugar beets. And this was really the big pull. The other two happened in western Nebraska also. There was railroad employment, there was meat packing, but the big draw there was sugar beets. It says in 1897, the U.S. Congress imposed a 75% tax on importation of foreign sugar, thus encouraging the development of the U.S. sugar beet industry. In 1900, there was 135,000 acres in the United States, and by 1920, that had expanded to 872,000 acres. The Great Plains region, including the North Platte Valley, which is where Scotts Bluff is located, accounted for 64% of that. At that time, in the early part of the 20th century, Nebraska was second behind Colorado in sugar beet production. In sugar beet acreage, and was first in yield per acre. So part of the reason sugar beets were grown there is the climate and the soil agreed very well with the sugar beets. Scotts Bluff County is still the top sugar beet producing county in Nebraska. I looked actually at the State Historical Society through some newspapers. I was really trying to find evidence of, again, published evidence of Latinos at this time in the early part of the 20th century, but I did find some interesting ads for land for sale specifically to grow sugar beets. I found those ads as early as 1908. One of the issues for Mexicans coming, again, crossing the border in coming to Nebraska to work with sugar beets was that during most of the Revolution, papers were not needed to cross the border. A literacy and head tax was implemented in 1917, but most Mexicans were exempted, especially when their labor was needed. In 1924, the Border Patrol was formed in 1924 with the National Origins Act, but still was not enforced very much, especially because of pressure in the Southwest and Midwest to meet the needs of the industrial and agricultural labor that were needed at that time. This slide gives us a little bit of an example of the foreign-born in Nebraska, and in Omaha is the red. And as we can see, despite, I think, what some people think, the number of foreign-born in Nebraska in general is far lower than it was at many other times. And even though it was lower in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, percentage-wise, it's not that big a change. It's not that big a difference. So we've had these immigrant communities coming to Nebraska and to western Nebraska and the entire state for quite some time. Initially, just to kind of put another spin on this, the sugar beets were worked by German Russians and even Japanese, but the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907 with Japan and World War I halted those labor sources, right? So people still needed someone to work on their farms in western Nebraska. In addition to these labor streams drying out, many of the Germans from Russia were moving to other types of employment, including purchasing or renting farmland of their own. And again, going back to these early articles in the Scottsbluff Republican, which was the newspaper at the time, I found a 1910 newspaper article about the profitability of growing sugar beets, in which they accounted for, and this was a quote, 80 acres rented to a German farmer. So I found a lot of articles that alluded specifically to this German person or this Italian person I haven't found any with Mexican persons yet, but I'm sure I will as I move forward. Just a kind of a little caveat here, something that I found interesting was also at that time, and this kind of shows this general anti-immigrant sentiment that was around then and that we still have today. This was a 1918 article, again about a German farmer, and the title was "Bayard People Stand by George Harms." And this was a letter from some citizens in Bayard defending this George Harms from anti-German sentiments, accusing George of being unpatriotic. And apparently these statements had been made previously in the newspaper. And one of the quotes was, "He raised sugar beets for 4 years." So that was a positive thing that they saw from George Harms, that he had successfully raised sugar beets and made a profit. And again, it shows how big sugar was at the time in western Nebraska. So again, labor streams drying up, and people that had previously done that labor moving on. So the Mexicans were the new labor source for many of these industries.
Something is not right here, so
Okay.
let me be a groupie for a moment and
Okay, I'm gonna
keep going.
I'm gonna soldier on, and you can figure that out. Yeah. So Mexicans came largely to work both in the fields and in the processing factories. Initially, it was only in the fields that beets were grown, but then around as early as 1917, the processing factories were built in Scottsbluff and Bayard and some of the surrounding areas. Initially, some people did not want to hire Mexican laborers because, according to an official of the Continental Sugar Company, this was in Michigan, and so I'm still kind of on the Midwest, but according to this person in Michigan, many of the farmers believed that Mexicans were dangerous because they all carried knives. And so there was a reluctance to hire Mexicans until after the first season, when people hired Mexicans on the first season and said, "Wow, they don't all carry knives, and they're really hard workers," then they were hired subsequently. Interestingly enough, and I'll get back to this idea and this theme, but it's this theme that mirrors this kind of criminality of Mexicans and Latinos in general. The work was seasonal, so a lot of the workers left the fields to work on the railroads and meat packing and other kinds of jobs, so employers had to find ways to try to keep the people there so that they could work when they needed them. Okay, let me go. Oh, you moved it forward. Well, that's fine. Okay, and actually, this is what's coming up next here. Employers, in order to try to keep people there, started hiring families instead of only what they called the solteros, which were the single males, to keep them on the job, and so that they could have more workers at those times when they needed it. They could, instead of hiring just the male, they could hire the wives for a day or for a week, and the children if they were old enough. Sometimes some farmers withheld payment for the work until the work was completed, and in some cases until the family came back the next year. So they would say, "Unless you come back next year, we're not going to pay you. We'll pay you next year for this year's work." On the other hand, some people paid bonuses for returning. Instead of withholding the pay, they said, if you come back next year, we'll pay you more. So I don't want to put it in the light that all these farmers were taking advantage and that there were all these cruel people that were mistreating the Mexican workers. There were people that went the other way. There was also resistance among the workers. There was work stoppages, shutdowns, and strikes. So it wasn't as if these people had no agency or no say themselves, and no sense of their own self-development, right? So the agricultural needs of western Nebraska mirrored, the agricultural needs of western Nebraska did not mirror the largely urban lives that a lot of these people had come from. So they'd come from rural areas, but didn't necessarily do agricultural work. And if those of you that are familiar with places like, again, Kearney, North Platte, Scotts Bluff, those places in western Nebraska, even though some of them are in central Nebraska, they're communities of 20, 25, 30,000 people. And I think there's an assumption, I know I've been told this before, you're from Scotts Bluff, you must know something about farms. Well, not really. And I think the same thing was happening here. These people were from what might be considered rural areas, but they weren't necessarily familiar with the agricultural work. So this was one of the problems that they had. Another problem that they had was most were not prepared for the cold weather. A lot of them, even though they didn't come, some of them came directly from Mexico to Nebraska or to Scottsbluff, but a lot of them made stops in Texas or other places. But they were still coming from the south into the north, into the cold Nebraska weather, and they weren't always ready for that. In addition, Mexicans were blamed, again, getting back to this kind of criminalizing element, for, among other things, and there's a quote, for spreading marijuana. Just as the Chinese carry the opium habit wherever they migrate, Mexicans carry marijuana. This was a quote, again, from the time. I don't know if it was from the same person that talked about all the Mexicans carrying knives, but this was one of the myths that was disproved. But again, it ties into this criminality, the Mexican bandit stereotype, and a stereotype that I think we still have with us with, quote, illegal aliens. Mexicans were welcomed by employers, but not everybody in the community. And let's see, yeah, this slide is a little out of order. This was a quote from Agnes Fenton in 1930, and she said, while social workers are afraid that the peons, those were the Mexicans that she's referring to, will not mix with our native populations, the eugenicists are afraid they will. So there was some people, just like we have today, that were afraid for whatever reason, that were anti-immigrant, and there was others that welcomed these groups. As I said already, just again a little bit of an aside here, the women in the cities worked oftentimes in the meat packing plants, in the sugar beet factories, and in the railroad yards, forming the reserve army of industrial labor. They were hired many times on a daily basis, sometimes for a week, and they were usually paid about half the rate of what the men earned for doing the same work. So these were supplements to family incomes, and they were uneven, so they weren't relied on, but they helped people survive and helped people get through those times. It's just an example that poor women in general have been working way before the 70s, right, when women went outside the home to liberate themselves. I guess poor women have been liberated since there's been poor women because they've been working as long. Let me move now to specifically this history of the colonia in Scottsbluff, which again mirrors the movement of Mexicans into the Midwest in general, which I've been talking about here. I've already said that a lot of these communities are near the railroads. I know they are in Omaha, in Lincoln, and Scottsbluff, and many towns in between. Originally, a lot of these started out as tent communities and then moved into more permanent. Boxcars were oftentimes used. People slept in boxcars. I remember as a young child, I couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, visiting my grandfather. This was the late 60s, early 70s, and he lived in a boxcar. It was just him by himself, but he lived in a boxcar. He bunked there with a couple of other men when he worked on the railroad. Company towns, so-called company towns, also kept the labor there by making them dependent. And what we have here is some photos of, this is southeast Scottsbluff, but this used to be a company town owned by Great Western Sugar. It then changed to, and I'll talk about this a little bit in a few minutes, not a Mexican neighborhood, but a Germans from Russia neighborhood, and then Mexicans moved in after that. The reason I showed this picture is because you can see the smokestack from the sugar factory in the background here. Another thing that you can see is this, how small this house is right here. And you can get, put it in perspective by looking at that vehicle on the side there, right? It's barely small enough that you can, it's hard to stand up in those towns. My parents still live very close to here, and talking about the proximity to the railroads, the last I heard, 26 coal trains pass through Scottsbluff every 24 hours at all times of the day and night. And even though they're trying to work on abatement of the blowing the horns blow at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning. I remember going to college at UNL and staying in, I think it was Schramm Hall, and at that time there was a railroad near there. And I remember a lot of students saying, yeah, I can't sleep at night because the railroad keeps me up. And for me, it was quite the contrary. The railroad and hearing the trains was kind of a comfort for me because it reminded me of home. And still today, when I go home, occasionally when I've taken friends there, they're bothered by the railroad, the sound of the railroad, and it doesn't bother me at all. So I guess we just adapt and get used to those kinds of things. There's two main places where I got the history, what I call the documented history of this colonia, this community in Scottsbluff, this Mexican community. And those were the Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, which I'll get to here in a minute, and the history of celebrating September 16th. But before I do that, and see, I don't use PowerPoint often, so I have to go back and forth between the PowerPoint and my talk here. But let me give you a couple of other pictures of some of the company housing here. Again, you can see from the size of the fence how small this house is. This was a house that Liz Keller, I remember again when I was a young boy, a woman named Liz Keller lived there. She was she was probably one of those original, I always get it confused, is it Russians from German or Germans from Russia or both? But you can see how small this house is. She lived in there until the 70s. I remember she would back her, and I get these Model A and Model T car, Ford confused also, but she would back her, I'll just say Model T, Ford out of the driveway and drive down the street. And we always thought it was quite a curious sight because this was a largely Mexican-American community, and there was this one, 75-year-old white lady living there, which we always thought was kind of curious. Just to show kind of that transition in the neighborhood, I remember as a kid, I delivered newspapers in this neighborhood for 4.5 years. And when I started delivering newspapers, there was a smattering, maybe 5 or 6 customers with names like Steinmiller and Cook and Keller. And then those people usually died off in the 4.5 years I was there, so that by the time I was done, there were no non-Spanish names on my paper route in this neighborhood. And so I saw, as a young child, definitely the changing of that neighborhood. One of the things I remember the most is the smells, because we still had to go from house to house to collect money. And I remember going into the Germans from Russia houses, and there was this smell that I could never get. What was that smell? And I didn't like the smell at the time. I've learned now in my later life, because I now cook these things in my house, that it was probably boiled broccoli or cabbage, and it just had kind of which I thought at the time was kind of a rotten smell. But I do remember, going through on spring and summer days and smelling the different kitchens, the probably arroz con pollo coming out of this kitchen over here, and again, I don't know, but the cabbage coming out of this kitchen over here, where there was that combination for some time. Neighborhood's mostly, if not all, Mexican and Mexican-American. Again, a picture of this house. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. That house again. That house back there, in the yellow house way in the background, that's my parents' house. So not all the houses are this small. Their house was a small 2-room house, but it's been built on a number of times since then, as have most in the neighborhood. One of the things, and these houses are just down the block, but people still live in these houses. When I was there, and I was there at 6 in the morning because I didn't want people to see me taking photos of their house, at any other time of the day. So I went early in the morning, but I saw people leaving and entering those houses. Here you can see the flower pot, the sprinkler here on the side, and the hose. And one time when I was walking, not when I was taking these pictures, but when I was walking through there, I saw a family come home. There was a couple kids. So there's children and families living in these houses. This house I took a picture of, and I think there's another one here. No, partly because it's so narrow, and I don't know that even how small it is comes through in that picture. It can't be more than 10 or 12 feet wide. I also particularly like this one because in Broken Hoops and Plains people, Rocco Heller refers to Don Martin Quijas. And for as long as I knew, Don Martin lived in this house. He was one of the early people in Scottsbluff back in the 1920s. So let me get now to Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, which is where, again, another photo of the plant here. This is a photo of Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. This was one of the places where I documented and knew that there was Mexicans at this time. In 1921, the first priest was appointed to Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. So I know that there was Mexicans at least as early as 1921. Again, I think that they were there earlier, but I know they were there at least at that time. Anybody that's familiar with Our Lady of Guadalupe Church in Omaha, I think these churches look very similar. They have the same name, but they also look very similar. Here you see the 1953, which when this building was built. You see the cornerstone there, and the Virgen de Guadalupe, and then the stained glass over the door, Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. So as I said, there was a priest in Our Lady of Guadalupe Church in 1921. In this, it's kind of surprising to me, in this parish that's probably 95%, maybe more Mexican origin. There's only been one Mexican-American priest, Father Max Valdez, that was there in the 60s and into the 70s. So when we're talking about people controlling the institutions in their community and in their neighborhoods, the church has not historically been one of these places where Mexican-Americans and Latinos have had that control. And I see this as kind of illustrating that point. This parish, Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish in Scottsbluff, is the Mexican parish in western Nebraska. So whereas most parishes, Catholic parishes, it's an area around the parish. For Our Lady of Guadalupe here, people come from 30 miles around to go to Mass at Our Lady of Guadalupe. Not only do they come from other neighborhoods in Scottsbluff, they come from other small towns in the area. Currently, let me move forward here. This is this is the Guadalupe Center, the recreational center that's associated with the parish. And the Spanish Mass, I'll get back to these. The Spanish Mass at Our Lady of Guadalupe, and here we see Scottsbluff going back to having a lot of Mexicans as opposed to just Mexican Americans. But the Spanish Mass is so big, they have to say it at the Guadalupe Center. They have to have the Mass at the Guadalupe Center because the church won't hold that many people. Let me talk a little bit more about I'm going to move on to the September 16th celebration. This was another place where there was documentation of Mexicans being in western Nebraska in the early 1920s. Was the celebrating of 16 de Septiembre, the Mexican Independence Day, which is September 16th. Here we have some photos. This was a photo exhibit from the 2010 celebration this past September. You can see some of the photos are more recent. They're in color, but some of them are older. In this photo in particular, and those of you that are familiar with Latino community in Omaha will recognize some of these. They talk about, list down there, Dolores Castañeda, who became Dolores Wright, who owned Howard's Charro restaurant in Omaha, and was in many ways a pillar of the Latino community in Omaha for many years. She passed away a couple years ago. And there's also in this photo Bill Salazar, who is the uncle of Ben Salazar, the editor of Nuestro Mundo, again in Omaha. This photo was taken, all I was told definitively was the early 20s. They think it was 1923, but it was the early 20s. And so we have again this documentation of this community being in Scottsbluff at that time. And also for me, it shows the numerous ties between a lot of the Mexican and Mexican-American communities across the state. Running a little short on time, so I'm going to move forward here a bit. Not all the people in Scottsbluff are obviously coming from, came there in the 1920s. In fact, throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and into today, there were migrant farm workers, and they, what we call, settled out. In fact, my family, my father's family, went there about 1948, and the story was that they were headed, the two parents and 7 or 8 children, and who knows, 2 or 3 dogs. This is the story anyway, right? Whether it's true or not, there has to be some truth to it. But they're headed north from Texas, and they're in a Model T pulling a trailer. So there's 8 or 10 people and a couple dogs in this small car. And every time they go over a hill, the radiator pops off because the car overheats. So they get to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the guy in Cheyenne, Wyoming asks my grandfather, "Where are you going?" And he said, "We're going to Montana to work in the sugar beet fields." And the guy shakes his head and says, "You're never going to make it." He said, "Go over here to Minutair, Nebraska." Minutair is about 10 miles from Scottsbluff. "Go over here to Minutair, Nebraska, talk to the Zeilers." He even gave them a name, and they'll give you work there. So they went to Minutair, Nebraska. They found the Zeilers, and they found work. They went back to Texas that year, came back the second year, and my father has been there since, right? Some of his other family moved on after a number of years, but he's been there since. So again, that pull of the sugar beets. one of the things, they came from Texas, my father's family, which kind of mirrors people going to Schuyler. A lot of people don't come straight from Mexico. They go to Chicago or California or Florida and then go to Schuyler or Lexington or other places. There's still a migrant farm worker stream in western Nebraska, but it's really slowed to a trickle because of technological advances in planting sugar beets and eliminating weeds. The percentage of the Mexican origin population, which continues to change into a Latino population with time, that percentage in Scottsbluff has stayed pretty constantly between 20 and 25%. It's closer to 20% for the county and 25 to 30% for the town of Scottsbluff itself. And it's been pretty constant for the last few decades. There has been a slight rise in the foreign-born population in Scottsbluff, but definitely not as big as the foreign-born population of Schuyler, Nebraska, and other similar places. So I'll move now to Schuyler. And again, I'm going to have to move through this fairly quickly. The Hispanic population in Schuyler rose 1,377% from 1990 to 2000, and is today officially 62% Hispanic according to the 2010 U.S. Census. And I say officially because the population is definitely more than that, because the census undercounts people. And so officially 62%. Unlike Scottsbluff, where there's a fifth generation of U.S.-born Latinos, Schuyler's Latino population is almost entirely an immigrant population and their offspring. When I was in Schuyler doing my dissertation research, again, I lived there for a couple years. I did observation. I taught adult ESL in order to gain entree so that people would give me interviews. I interviewed 20 Latinos and 10 other people in the community, and I also relied on census data and media data and other information. So again, some pictures of the, I'll move on to this. This is my hypothesis when I'm going into Schuyler working for my dissertation, was that, let's see, my hypothesis was that basically that Latinos are not allowed, and I put allowed in quotation marks because some of it is self-censoring, it's self-chosen, but not allowed to be Americans and thus are denied access to community resources such as jobs, education, housing, political power. And this proved largely to be true. I had the example of the police chief saying that he thought there were Latinos in Schuyler that didn't call the police when they were victims of crime because they either didn't speak the language or they didn't trust the police. And I think, again, it's this idea that police protection is for, in their terms, Americanos. There was instances of people that could have done jobs, but they didn't apply for them because they would say, that job is for Americanos, not for me. So this was how I worked this hypothesis here. What I saw in Schuyler was a lot of what Martha Menchaca calls social apartness, and she defines this as a system of social control in which the Mexican origin people are expected to interact with Anglo-Americans only on Anglo-American terms. And the result is that there's a system in place where the Anglos get to decide when and where people meet. The first time I went to Schuyler, one of the first things I noticed was that there was little greetings between groups. White people would greet white people and Latinos would greet Latinos, but they didn't. It was almost as if the other population was invisible. There was also, I remember this almost a surreal moment when I was in this Latino mass. It was a Spanish mass, and everybody at the mass was Latino. And then I get out, and I'm driving. I think I was driving home back to Omaha. Schuyler's about an hour and 15 minutes west of Omaha, and I saw this older white couple in the car next to me. And it took me a couple of seconds to remember and go, oh yeah, there's white people in Schuyler too. Because where I had just been was all these brown people, all these Spanish-speaking people, and so there's this real difference between the white community and the Latino community in Schuyler. And again, it's not all one-sided. It's not just that whites want to keep Latinos at arm's length. In fact, oftentimes, Latinos aren't even aware of the white community there because they live within their own community. They don't have to speak English because they own some of the stores and restaurants, and at work, not all of them, but a lot of them work at the meatpacking plant where their supervisors and bosses are other Latinos now. It wasn't that way 10 years ago, but that's how it is now. Some of the issues in Schuyler were language differences and not always Spanish-English. There was a number of indigenous people from Guatemala who didn't speak Spanish well. I almost didn't believe it the first time I heard someone say, oh no, yeah, there's language problems, but not English-Spanish. It's because I can't understand the Mexicans. This person happened to be an indigenous person from Guatemala. And me, I'm over there in my ivory tower. I kind of don't believe him. I'm saying, oh yeah, sure, it can be. Well, it was, and those were big issues there. There's more of a mix in Schuyler in terms of Mexicans still being the majority, but there's a number of Guatemaltecos and Salvadoreños and others, people from Puerto Rico, Peru, Cuba, Honduras, almost every country. Most Mexican Americans, to give you an example of what I'm talking about here, most Mexican Americans in Scottsbluff wouldn't know a pupusa from a Guatemalan tamale. Right? I had my neighbor one time when I lived there, she brought me some tamales, and they were wrapped in banana leaves, which was different from the corn husks that I was used to. And there still was the corn, but inside was olives and green peppers and pig's feet. And that was a Guatemalan tamale, which I could hear my friends in Scottsbluff and even my friends in Omaha and Lincoln going, what is that? Pig's feet and a tamale, you gotta be crazy. So these were some of the differences. There was also much more resentment from the Anglo community. The people in Scottsbluff have had 100 years to kind of adjust, and not even really adjust, because there was new immigrant communities there, the Russian Germans, the Poles, the Czechs, others at the same time that the Mexicans were coming in. In Schuyler, I hear a lot of the Anglos talking about the changes to our town and to our community. So there's much more resentment there. This is a tale of similarities and differences in Latino communities, one that has existed for almost 100 years and one that's about 20 years old. Some of the differences in Schuyler, there's a lot of tienditas, small stores that sell products from Mexico and Guatemala and El Salvador. There's kind of been more of those more recently in Scottsbluff because there is a bigger influx of Latino immigrants, but there's definitely not as much as there are in Schuyler. There's much more Spanish spoken in Schuyler than there is in Scottsbluff, in stores, in schools, and in homes. Most of my interviews in Schuyler were in Spanish. Most of my interviews in Scottsbluff will be in English. Schuyler does not have as much residential segregation, except for the trailer parks, which are about 100% Latino. But other than that, it's too small. There's not like a Mexican or a Latino side of town, which is not true. There is a Mexican side of town in Scottsbluff. In Scottsbluff, Latinos think of themselves in general more as Americans and just as deserving as white Americans to all the community resources that are being spoken about here with social apartness. And there's just some of the similarities, what I call similarities and differences. There's a Latino Catholic church or a mission in Schuyler, and there's a Mexican American Catholic church in Scottsbluff. But the Latino Catholic church, the mass was much different. Honestly, it was much more lively. The people there in Schuyler, everybody knew the words to every song. It wasn't just the choir singing, but it was all 300 people that were there at the time. Scottsbluff, Our Lady of Guadalupe has the guitar mass sometimes, but this was just people. They weren't standing up and clapping, but they were playing guitar and singing with gusto. And I remember one time I was in mass there, and the priest, the congregation must have fell asleep a little bit. I don't know, they fell asleep, but there was a response, and he waited, and he made them do the response again. He said, "I can't hear you," and they had to do it louder, and I think he had them do it 3 times. I've never seen that in Scottsbluff. I saw it in Schuyler. So a little bit of the similarities, but also some differences at the same time. There's still prejudice and discrimination in both these areas. Only the nature has changed, and I see this a lot. I saw some of the ugliest prejudice when Schuyler was trying to pass a school bond issue, and when Scottsbluff was trying to elect a Latino, candidate for sheriff, and I was looking at the letters to the editor in the newspapers, and there was some stuff in there. I couldn't even believe that the newspapers published some of the letters that they published. Just a lot of prejudice that you can imagine. So I'll just let you imagine it. In both locations, Latinos replaced a largely European-American population in jobs and housing. Both had this kind of ethnic history of, again, Czechs, Poles, Germans, Russians, and Latinos in different ways came in. In Scottsbluff, they experienced that 100 years ago. Schuyler's still dealing with these changes. So let me move quickly now to the legacy. What does this mean? Well, you look at some of the thank yous here. Scottsbluff has a vibrant Mexican-American community today, a mixture of second, third, fourth, and even fifth generation Mexican-Americans. Mostly monolingual English speakers. I grew up speaking only English. I learned Spanish in college like a lot of young people do today. There's some newer Mexicans and some Central Americans, but not as much as there are in Schuyler. Schuyler continues to grow, and the Latino immigrants and their children continue to assimilate. I've had a few in my UNO classes, and they continue to join the U.S. middle and upper classes. There's still segregation and still discrimination in both of these places. However, my success and the success of others similar to me, I know of 8 PhDs and law degrees from the tiny little neighborhood, from just the 2 or 3 block area around where my parents live, from Scottsbluff alone. And this is a direct legacy of this aftermath of this settlement and discrimination. This is kind of the pushback to the discrimination. If you oppress people, they're going to say, what do I have to do to overcome that oppression? And what I have to do is be successful. There's a new anti-immigrant hysteria in Nebraska, and people who say that it has nothing to do, that immigration has nothing to do, that it has nothing to do with immigration per se, it's the illegal part, they're lying to themselves. They betray themselves with statements like, they should at least learn English, right? To which I reply, the Canadian undocumented persons already know English, and they probably know French too. So when they say stuff like that, they should at least learn English, they're really revealing what kind of immigrants they're talking about. Running out of time, so I'll skip over that. I guess I'll kind of part here by saying Nebraskans have to decide how much they want to pay to tolerate some of this xenophobic, anti-Latino, anti-immigrant prejudices of their neighbors, because we know it's not everybody in Nebraska. I don't even believe it's a majority myself. Costs can be measured economically in terms of higher prices due to reduced productivity, the money to fight lawsuits, but more importantly, the price of division created when these ideas are brought to public forums through proposed legislation, demonstrations, and in private living rooms. I have faith and confidence in my fellow Nebraskans that these bigoted and poisonous ideas come from a small but vocal minority. I have some other kind of statistics and demographics here, but I'll let you go to the OYA's website to see some of those kinds of things. And I will get back to, briefly, the flag. It's no longer in the church basement. It's now at the Guadalupe Center behind some glass. I couldn't even get a good picture of it. Go back to this original picture. I'm still trying to find out the provenance of this flag. So anybody in Scottsbluff that sees this, if you know where this flag came from and the time, contact me. Thank you very much for listening today. If there's any questions, I'll entertain questions. Questions? Yeah.
General question, I'm curious whether how you respond to it. I lived in the South for 5 years.
Okay.
I'm a Yankee, but 5 years of experience. And I was a community organizer. I worked with black and white communities that were forced together. And there was, although a strong amount of prejudice between them, there's also a familiarity and an acceptance one another on a personal basis. I'm curious whether your experience in Omaha, a larger urban environment where people probably can avoid one another far more than they can in either Schuyler or maybe in Scottsbluff.
Yeah.
Whether the prejudices function more institutionally, but there's a personal acceptance and familiarity, for example, in Scottsbluff, in the two communities.
Yeah, well, I think that does happen, although the residential segregation in Omaha is extreme. And in some ways, maybe it's what you said, it's that institutional instead of, it eliminates the possibility of those personal connections because people don't live near each other and don't go to the same schools. I know people that live in Omaha that say, oh, I've never been to South Omaha, or I've never met a Mexican, and there's 50,000 Latinos in Omaha. And so I think it's a little of both. Again, I wouldn't stereotype and say that it's dichotomously all this or all that. But I think there is some familiarity, and it really goes back to the generations. Third and fourth and fifth generations definitely have that familiarity. If you go to the GI Forum to have lunch in Omaha, you'll see you'll see Mexicans, you'll see Mexican Americans, whites, blacks. It's really a nice mixture of the U.S. However, there's still those new immigrants that don't speak English and don't have much contact with mainstream communities, whether it be white or Mexican American. Yeah. There's another question over here. Yeah.
I was wondering, it seems almost impossible to have some kind of representation in our government. Is that because we're not enough in one area to elect somebody? Or for what reason would you say we have no representation?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and part of what I skipped over here, I was going to talk about Scotts Bluff, because Scotts Bluff, again, has had this fairly large Mexican-American community for, 60 years at least, where it's been 20 to 25%. And if Scotts Bluff has 5 city councilmen, you would think that even by coincidence, occasionally there would be a Mexican-American elected. And that didn't happen until about the 1990s. Part of the reason is, I don't know that it's numbers necessarily, because most minorities, Latino, black, or otherwise, that get elected have to rely on large numbers of whites to elect them. In terms of the electorate in Nebraska and in the country, a lot of people think the reason Latinos don't vote in proportionate to their representation in the society is because they're not citizens. And it's actually because they're not 18 years old. The age, and again, this was a key point that I ran out of time at the end, but age is one of the biggest demographic changes that we're going through. The median age, which is not the average but the middle, where half the population is older and half younger, the median age, more or less for Nebraska and the United States, Nebraska is a little bit younger, but whites, the median age is generally about 40. For Hispanics, it's 27. I'm sorry, for Hispanics, it's 24 in Nebraska. For Mexican origin persons, it's 22. So this change in terms of Hispanics, the numbers growing, are not just immigration, but also who's at the age in which they're going to give birth. And you can see that there's going to be a lot more people around 22 than there's going to be around 40. But to answer your question specifically in terms of electoral politics, I think in 10 years, if Latinos go out and vote, this is going to change. I don't know that it's going to change in 4 or 5 years, but people are going to start turning 18 and they're going to start to vote. Scotts Bluff, which is, again, about the county's 20% of Mexican American and Latino, but 3 in 10 school children, people of school children age, are Latinos. And this is true across the country, that the Latinos in grade schools and junior highs and high schools far outpace their representation in the community in general. This is an issue that we're going to have to work with, where we have an older white community in the United States and a younger Latino community, and hopefully at some point they won't be different. They won't be different communities. There will just be older people and younger people, and we won't have to designate white, Latino, Hispanic, those kinds of things. Yeah, question?
So do Mexicans and Guatemalans not speak the same language?
For a lot of the Guatemalans in Schuyler, most of them were indigenous. They're Canjobales and Mames, and there was 2 other indigenous groups. There was 4 indigenous Guatemalan groups represented just in the small town of Schuyler. So for Guatemalans, for those people, Spanish was their second language. They did speak some Spanish, but they didn't speak Spanish well, and so they did have some communication issues. Guatemalans and Mexicans, for the most part, both speak Spanish, but obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but for most Mexicans, that's their first language and they're very comfortable with it. For the Guatemalans that I talked to and that I interviewed, they spoke some Spanish, but they weren't very fluent. They weren't real fluent. Costa Ricans, I don't know. Costa Ricans don't have a big push, so there's not as many in the country. Yeah, back there.
In Schuyler, did you see between the Guatemalans and the Salvadorians and the Mexicans, did you see any conflict between the groups, or were there a lot of, were they friendly?
Yeah, well, my second hypothesis for my dissertation was that those different national groups would form a true Latino community in Schuyler, as opposed to like Chicago, where because it's so big, there's a Mexican community and a Puerto Rican community and a Cuban community. And I thought in Schuyler, it's small, they'll all have to interact. and they'll form true Latino community there. And the answer to that hypothesis was yes and no. So that they formed a community as opposed to, again, the lighter-skinned English community that they saw was some kind of a threat to them. But then once they broke down back into their Guatemalan, Mexican, and Salvadoran communities, there was some animosity, and they all had stories or negative things to say about each of the other groups. So, and some of that had to do with the way that things were organized at the meat processing plant, where not everybody, but a lot of people worked, where generally Mexicans were moving into some of the management and higher positions, and the Guatemalans and Salvadorans were the workers. So some of that animosity stemmed from there. The difference, one of the differences that I saw was the first generation immigrants, the people that were 30 and 40 and 50 when I was there 10 years ago, 5 or 10 years ago, they saw a big difference. But the people, the young children that I spoke to informally at the school, they knew that people's parents were from Guatemala or El Salvador, but amongst themselves, they didn't see a difference. So there might be this generational change where Latinos are starting to become Latinos instead of Mexicans, Guatemalans, and Salvadorans. Yeah. Yeah.
What did you see as the playing of soccer do in Scott's Bluff?
See, you know, I haven't seen as much of that in Scotts Bluff, but in Schuyler,
I meant
Schuyler, okay, Schuyler, yeah. Schuyler, there was a Latino soccer league. It was big for Schuyler. I know people came from towns around. I don't know how far they came, but my guess is they came from probably as far as Norfolk. There was about between 12 and 14 teams, depending on the year, and most of the teams were from like all Guatemalans, and the other teams weren't all Mexicans, but they were all Mexicans from Guerrero or from Jalisco. And then even beyond that, there was teams that were all Mexicans from Chichihualco, a specific small town in Guerrero that about 25 to 30% of Latinos in Schuyler were from this small town. There were, that I knew of, there was one team that had 3 Anglo players on it. Other than that, no, actually, everybody else wasn't Latino. The other people that if you went to watch the game, you wouldn't be able to tell, but there was one team that had at least 2 players from Iraq. Because I remember this one of my ESL students was kind of upset because he said, "Oh, I can't even talk to them." I said, "What do you mean you can't talk?" He said, "They're from Arabia." You see, you're saying Arabia. That was his term from them. I'm pretty sure they were from Iraq, but yeah, I don't know that it created a bridge between Anglo and Latino communities because there wasn't a lot of Anglos playing. Although it could have changed in the last 5 years, 6 years since I've been there.
Well, what I'm getting at is, was there a spillover in the high schools where maybe Schuyler would have had a better soccer team in high school?
Well, not when I was there, but that's happening now. And actually, I'm glad you followed up in that way because from what I've heard now, Schuyler does have a pretty good soccer team. I think they're rated number 1, although I could be have seen this wrong. But they have a really good soccer team now within the last 3 or 4 years. And in fact, I know that I've heard stories that some of the Anglo residents of Schuyler have kind of rallied around the soccer team because when they've gone to play other schools in their home fields, those fans have yelled racial epithets at the Schuyler players. And so even the white Schuyler players and even the white people in Schuyler are saying, "Hey, this isn't right." And so I think in that sense it has formed a little bit of a togetherness there. Yeah.
Could you comment on relationships in Crete?
You know, I know a little bit about Crete. I don't know as much. When I was choosing my where to do my dissertation research and I was looking at identity, I chose Schuyler because it was more or less a Latino white of difference. And I know in Crete there's a large number of Hmong and other Southeast Asians and Somalis and Sudanese also. And for me, in terms of doing the research, that kind of just clouded the issue. I'm sure some of the situations and the issues are similar, but when you're talking about foreign-born there, it's not just Latino foreign-born. It's people from all other areas, which create good things and bad things, right? They might create more tension, but it makes it more lively and more interesting. But I don't know a lot about Crete specifically. Yeah. Yeah, I can.
Are there other communities that have been more successful in welcoming and integrating new immigrants into their community? And if so, what? I mean, what are the secrets to that success?
Well, I know Schuyler, because Schuyler saw what Lexington went through and what some communities in Kansas, Dodge City and Garden City and some other communities had gone through when meatpacking plants were closed, deunionized, and then reopened, and unemployment rates were low, so employers went south of the border to try to recruit people. And I think they tried to head some of the negative things. They tried to head them off. I can't think of specifics that they did. One of the issues, and this relates back to the issue of social apartness that I was talking about, is that at least officially, at least formally, there was a desire by people from the city council, the Chamber of Commerce, and other kind of official powers in the city to incorporate Latinos. They wanted Latinos to come to the meetings, they wanted them to be involved, but they also wanted them to see a flyer and then say, a flyer in English, and then say, oh, I'm going to come to that meeting. Whereas you need a flyer in English and Spanish, and you need to make some phone calls, and you need to go visit some homes if you want people to come out in that way, because again, there's that perceived threat that they're looking at. So I think Schuyler's doing better now than even when I finished my dissertation research in 2004. I haven't been back, but I've followed up a little bit with the Schuyler Sun, and then again looking at the soccer team, that they're doing better. They also in many ways don't have a choice because the town's 62% Latino. Lexington is 60% Latino. So it's like a recent article said, aquí estamos y no nos vamos. We're here and we're staying. We're not going anywhere. And so I think for good or for bad, whether people like it or not, they're saying, you know what, we have to adjust. And they are. Yeah. So things, I think, are starting to improve in those towns, as they have in some ways in Scottsbluff. And in Scottsbluff, some of the things are still there. In some ways, things haven't improved a lot.
The ways that people adjust is if they're an element of white flight.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it was a term that was used in Schuyler. I didn't bring up the term. In fact, it was some teachers, a principal who's no longer there, and one of the school superintendent who's no longer there for various reasons. But they talked specifically about white flight because Anglos did not want their children to go to school with Latinos in Schuyler. In Schuyler, and again, this is different from Scottsbluff, but in Schuyler, when I was there, and I can only imagine it being more concentrated, Head Start was 100% Latino. The kindergarten was 95% Latino. The grade school in general was 75%. And then it was a little bit less. The junior high was about 2/3, and the high school was about 1/3 to 1/4. But yes, there was a lot of white flight, which I think has contributed to this 62% that we're looking at, because the population of the town has gone up, but not that much. Yes? When I was in school, there were a few. In Scottsbluff, there were a few. In Schuyler, there was no Latinos in any formal position in the school or otherwise. So there was some in Scottsbluff, but not very many.
Hispanic terms?
You know, I didn't speak Spanish growing up, but when I did go to school, it was a little bit easier, not a lot easier, but a little bit easier, because some of the terminology was I knew how it sounded. There was terms that were used by my parents or by people in the community that then once I started studying Spanish, I recognized the term, but I didn't know what it meant. So I knew how to say it, to go, oh, that's what that means right there. Okay, so my parents, yes, but more so the people in the community. I had some friends whose parents in Scottsbluff were not a very large percentage, but there were people always coming from Mexico to Scottsbluff, and I had some friends whose parents only spoke Spanish, and in those situations I learned more of that. Yeah. Anything else? Thanks for coming. I really loved talking to you, and thanks for all the interesting questions.